This is lesson 5, looking at changing gender roles and parent-child relationships in the family. So today we're going to explore how some sociologists argue that gender roles in the family have changed, while others argue they haven't changed that much. We are also going to assess how parent-child relationships have changed over the last 50 years. So having a look at some of the pictures on this particular slide shows some of the big changes that have happened in the family since the 1960s. So on the left you've got some classic advertising and a few humorous bits about how the women in the 1950s were expected to be at home, looking after the family, cleaning and looking after their husbands. It also shows that children were viewed as little people who should be seen but not heard, and often children were left to their own devices. However, now you can see that things look quite differently. Our society has become increasingly child-centered, where families orientate their lives around the activities and the needs of their children. We can also see from these pictures that there are far more women who have careers and are also mothers, and the conjugal roles in the family are no longer as segregated, and men and women are doing both the breadwinner or instrumental role as well as the expressive role, looking after and caring for the family. So what are gender roles then? The official definition of gender roles is that gender roles are cultural as well as personal. They determine how males and females should think, speak, dress and interact within the context of society. This then defines what is masculine and what is feminine. So judging just from that definition, gender roles is clearly quite an important part of identity and function. So what's the big change? Well, as we have seen in previous lessons, in the 1960s men and women had very definite, separate and defined gender roles. This is called segregated conjugal roles. However, in recent times, men and women share the roles in the family, and these roles are no longer as set by gender. This is called integrated conjugal roles. Again, guys, it's really important that you know these key terms because they come up a lot and you need to know what they mean. If these keywords do come up in a question, you need to also try and give some examples for each of these different keywords. So examples of segregated conjugal roles and examples of integrated conjugal roles. It's a very popular 4-mark question. Okay. So what have the sociologists found? Well, as we're about to discover, some argue that gender roles have changed since the 60s. Others, however, argue that gender roles have not changed. Again, it might be really helpful for you to pause this video so that you can copy down what it says on this particular slide. I would recommend using a full A4 sheet, and if you've got big handwriting, try using a big A3 sheet. On the left hand side we have the green column with the smiley face. So this is where we'll put the sociologists who argue that gender roles have changed, that things have improved for the family. On the right hand side again we have a red column and a sad face. This is where we'll put the sociologists who argue that gender roles and relationships have not changed. This is a popular 12-mark essay question, so it'll be really good if you know what some of these different sociologists are saying. Let's start with some famous functionalists. Young and Wilmot in 1973 argue that a symmetrical family is now typical in Britain. This means that the conjugal roles or the family roles are more equal. So the mum and the dad both share equally in the housework, the childcare, and the expressive role that was traditionally done by the mum. They also argue that decisions on how to spend the family's money is shared more equally between the man and the woman in the family. This is important because decision making on how to spend money is one way of measuring the power relationship in the family. Gatrell in 2008 found that many fathers in dual worker couples, and this is where both the mum and the dad are in paid employment, play a much bigger role in their children's lives compared with fathers in the past. Hull in 1989, he found that compared with 30 years ago, more and more couples shared the decision making on how to spend the household income. Again, this is a show that power in the relationship is shifting from being simply in the hands of the male and rather as a shared decision-making process. Now, there are various reasons for these changes. The first big one is the rise in feminism. The more women who are believing that they have more rights and that they have the same opportunities to go out and work means that conjugal roles have had to change in the family. This, along with the availability of free contraception, has given women the power and the choice to choose how many children they have, if they have any. As a result, more women are going into full-time careers. And lastly, more leisure activities are taking place in the family home. Where before the dad would go to the pub and the mum would stay and have tea with friends, now more leisure activities are happening in the family home involving both the mum, the dad and the children. So let's, for example, think about movie night. Okay, so on the other side we have Crompton and Leonette in 2008. They argue that men's involvement in housework has increased less than the women's involvement in paid employment. This means that even though women are working more in careers, they are still doing more of the housework than the men. Or the housework is simply not getting done, which is pretty much what it's like in my house. This is a feminist view. They are arguing that even though women have more power and have more opportunity to have careers, they are still expected to do the housework on top of the work they're doing for their paid employment. They go on to argue that attributes to gender roles have changed a lot, but men's participation in household tasks has not changed much, and women still do most of the laundry and the cleaning in the house. So, what about children? Well, like I said at the beginning of this video, in the past children were seen and not heard. They were expected to occupy themselves, they were expected to behave, and they were expected pretty much to be invisible. Today, family life is very different. Family life is now very child-centered, where the family make plans around the activities and the likes and the dislikes of the children in the family. So how have the children and the parent relationships changed? Today, relationships between parents and children are less authoritarian. This means that children now have more freedom and more rights, and families are starting to involve their children in decision-making processes in the family. When I ask Eli what he'd like to do on the weekend, he'll often give me a good idea of what he would like to do, and more often than not, that is what we do. Secondly, families are much more child-centered. There is much bigger focus on the children's interests, and the parents orientate their lives around this. Thirdly, young people are more financially dependent on their family, and they are more dependent for longer. Children are expected to stay in education until they're 17 or 18, and they are therefore more reliant on their parents for a much longer period. So, what do you need to know to be ready for class? Firstly, what gender roles are and how they have changed. You also need to know which sociologists argue that gender roles have changed and which argue that they have not. And finally, you need to know some of the changes in the parent-child relationships. Test yourself now with the quiz.